Hi everyone, I'm Suma and I'm here with Richard Sylvester. He has written numerous books on non-duality and he holds meetings on non-duality and liberation. Welcome, Richard.
Good morning, good to be here.
Good to meet you in person.
Yeah.
I remember last time when we did the interview, we focused mainly on your book, Confessions of
That's
a Seeker. And I didn't get a chance to discuss about non-duality and especially your experience and how exactly it happened. It seems like there were two different occasions where the seeing happened for you.
Yes, we could talk about that. I mean, in some ways it can be interesting. I mean, although I've written about it, there's also a slight reluctance in me to talk about it because it can kind of make it sound important or as if somehow it has to happen this way. So we need to bear that in mind. But yeah, I've written about the fact that there were two events, let's call them. And if I'm being quite picky with language, I'd have to say that they didn't happen to me because a non-dual event really only happens when the person isn't there. In a sense, that's the nature of a non-dual event, that the person is missing, so we can't really say it's happened to me or to you or to anyone. But nevertheless, what happened here is fairly common. There was a kind of initial opening, let's say, which it could be described as timeless, but within the biographical history of an individual would have to be considered to be like a split-second event. And in an event like this, it's like the one way of describing it, it's like seeing that the emptiness of everything is suddenly seen. Everything is suddenly seen to be completely empty. And when I mean everything, I mean that which is normally considered to be external, like the external world, people, objects, that kind of thing, and that which is normally considered to be internal, in other words, the person, the individual, the self, if you like. So there can be this kind of sudden awareness or sudden awakening in which all of that is seen to be totally empty. It's just like empty form, as the Buddhists sometimes describe it. And of course, having said that, it then becomes apparent that the description that I've just given is a kind of nonsense, because if everything is empty, then there is no external world and a separate self here. There is just empty oneness, we might say. So that's how it sometimes happens for some individuals, and that's how it happened here, that initial, let's call it an initial awakening. That's not a good phrase, but you know, we have to use language, so let's use that one. Yeah. Shall I go on?
Was that like an energetic shift for you, or was it an experiential shift?
I would say it involves a huge energetic shift, not for me, not for anyone, because in a sense the whole nature of this is to see there isn't a me. That's the shock of it. I mean, this can be a huge shock. I mean, remember that you know, I, me, this character, this individual had spent 30 years seeking spiritually, and always the assumption was that I could find something, and that assumption had been encouraged by gurus and by teachers, or if they hadn't encouraged it, I hadn't heard them. You know, maybe it wasn't their fault, maybe I misheard them, because that's what the individual tends to do. So for 30 years, I thought I was searching for something which would somehow make sense of my life and of existence. And so then suddenly there is this shock of the realization that 30 years has been based entirely on a misapprehension. Indeed, the whole of this life up to that moment had been based on a misapprehension, or if you like, a mistake. And the misapprehension is that there is somebody here who is living in a world that they are separate from and can find in that world, or maybe in themselves, some kind of secret of life, if you like. So it's a tremendous shock to realise that, how can I put it, that this could never have done anything about the problem that it faced, because this was non-existent. It was always a kind of illusion. So, as I'm sure you're hearing, it's difficult to talk about this in normal language.
Yeah, there is, some people talk about non-duality speaks or Advaita speaks, but I feel like that may be...
Yeah, let's try to avoid that. Yes, over here in England, where non-duality talks are very popular, people talk about the Advaita police or the non-duality police, and this is a body of people who go around to talks and jump on speakers if they think they're using personal language. You know, that's absolutely ridiculous. So let's not go there. You know, it's difficult enough to talk about this in the first place without then trying to develop some special kind of language where we don't use words like I. You know, that if there was somebody from the Advaita police here, you know, and I say, this happened to me, they'll immediately jump on me and say, how can you say that? There is no I, there is no me. So we'll just ignore all of that, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. In your book, you have talked about the first time it happened, the ego came back.
Yes, you could put it that way, yeah.
And then after some years, it happened again.
After another year in the history of a person. And again, I think this is pretty common. I've talked to a lot of individuals where it's happened like this. It doesn't have to be like this, but it's pretty common that there can be this initial opening, and what I call that, what other speakers and writers call that, what some of the traditions call this, it's the seeing of emptiness. It's the seeing that this form, if you like, which seems so full and so solid, you know, I can reach out and touch my leg and so forth. It's the seeing that this apparently solid form is actually completely empty. It's just emptiness. We could say it's the appearance of everything arising out of emptiness. This is quite a common seeing. The thing about it is it doesn't in itself, I mean, it can be a tremendous shock. It can bring about great changes in the individual, but it doesn't in itself seem to put an end to the feeling of incompleteness that the individual has. So it doesn't put an end to seeking. So even after this seeing, there can very much be a feeling that, you know, okay, there's something missing still. There's something that I am not seeing. We might put it that way. And then what can sometimes happen, what happened here, is that in the story of of an individual moving through time, about a year later there was another kind of opening or seeing, and the inadequate way that I can describe that is that in this second opening, what is seen, once again, everything is seen to be empty. You know, the world and the apparent individual are both seen to be empty form, if you like, but this time it's also seen to be full. And as I say those words, I am well aware of the paradox and the impossibility of the mind understanding that, but it's still probably the clearest thing that I can say, that this is seen, yes, completely empty, almost like a hologram, arising out of nothing, falling away into nothing, but it's also completely full as well. And the obvious question that might come next is, well, if it's full, what do you mean by that? What's it full of? And again, inadequate language, but the nearest I could get to that is saying it's full of love. You know, this is we could say this is a spontaneous arising of love. Out of nothing, this is a spontaneous arising of love. And I'm again very well aware as I say that, of how the mind could rush in and ask many, many very difficult questions about that. And maybe we'll tackle those later, maybe we won't, we'll see. But that's pretty much the closest language can get, I think. And again, I think this seeing is described by many people, many individuals in this way, yeah.
And you may have a unique perspective on ego separation after the seeing happened, because when you never have a glimpse into that, the person never knows that you feel separate. That's the normal experience. When that happened to you, what is your insight on the nature of ego separation? How does it happen?
How does ego separation happen? I think anyone who goes there is taking a big risk. I think what we can be sure of is that in almost all cases it does happen. I mean, we could philosophize about it and indulge in an exploration of psychology about it. I mean, I've got a psychological background partly. And we can come up with all sorts of notions and theories, all of which are probably pretty untestable, but the one thing that we can be clear of is that ego separation, as you put it, does happen, or at least it happens in the majority of cases. I'm fairly sure that it doesn't happen in all cases. I've come across a few individuals where I feel like ego separation never really happened, or it never really fully happened. I've just been reading a biography of Jiddu Krishnamurti, and I mean, I've thought for many years, and I've said for many years, I mean, I can't know, but I feel like he was someone, from the descriptions of him when he was found as a very young boy by the Theosophists, from the descriptions given, it sounds to me like he never really had that separate ego sense happen for him. So that's the thing that we can be sure of, that for most people it does happen, that at a certain age, it doesn't really matter when, but I would suggest at the same sort of age, that there is a kind of working consciousness, a sort of what we might call a mind consciousness, maybe, certainly the first 3 years of life for most of us. This phenomenon happens whereby, having been born into oneness, right? So for the newborn child, the newborn baby, there is only oneness. There's no awareness of me as being separate from the world, from mother, from father, from the nursery and so forth. That out of that initial sense of oneness, at a certain point, there's a kind of condensing happens, a kind of condensation happens, so that this seemingly very solid sense of self, in the sense that I am a separate ego, I am a separate individual, emerges. And out of that, kind of a lot of problems spring, quite obviously. But that is what we could call the consciousness of normal everyday life. If anyone's puzzling over these terms non-duality and duality, what do we mean by this? Well, duality means two, right? So it's suggesting that there are two elements to existence. What are those two elements? Those two elements are the world, the external world, and separate from that external world and moving in it, the person. Those are the two elements of duality. So there's me existing in separation in a world which is separate and alien from me, which is a kind of pretty risky state of affairs and brings with it a lot of problems. And then non-duality, meaning not two-ness, is seen when that apparent separation between me and the world simply collapses, and it's seen that it was, let's say, always a kind of illusion.
And some have compared the non-duality to lucid dreaming.
Yeah.
Is that something that resonates with you?
Absolutely not. No, I draw no connection whatsoever. No, lucid dreaming is a phenomenon. I don't have much experience of it, either personally or through talking to others who do have more lucid dreams than I have. But I would say lucid dreaming, it's another experience. It's a very interesting one. I'm not surprised that people become fascinated by it and hooked on it and so forth, but I wouldn't draw any connection at all. Either in terms of, I'm hesitating because I have to use the word experience, either in terms of the experience itself, which is a misleading word because seeing non-duality is not an experience, but nevertheless, either in terms of the experience itself or in terms of causation. I certainly wouldn't draw any connection whatsoever between, let's say, having lucid dreams, developing more the ability to have lucid dreams if it's possible to do that, and the seeing of non-duality. No, I would draw no more connection there than between, say, the experience of eating ice cream and non-duality. Other than to say, of course, that non-duality embraces everything. So non-duality embraces lucid dreaming, eating ice cream, and everything else.
What are some of the misconceptions about non-duality?
I think the chief misconception, and over the last maybe 10, 20 years this has become much trickier than it used to be, the chief misconception is to suggest in some kind of subtle way that there is something that I personally, important word, I personally can do something to bring about that seeing. And that spawns, vast numbers of schools and suggestions and exercises and practices that, you do this, you follow me in this, you come to my classes in this, and that will bring about, or it may increase the chances of bringing about non-dual seeing. And I think this has become very tricky over the last 10 or 20 years, since non-duality has become such a kind of popular force, let's say, in spiritual discourse. How can I put this? The intelligent speaker knows that they probably shouldn't be sitting there actually saying, well, I have this practice here, and I will give you this practice, or sell it to you, or you give me a donation, whatever, for this practice, and this practice will purify you and will raise your vibration or your level of consciousness, and eventually non-dual seeing will take place. I mean, I'm aware that there is plenty of that stuff still out there, but the sophisticated teacher or guru knows that they can't really quite get away with that anymore. So the suggestion now is much more subtle. So it's like there's a kind of there may be an acknowledgement from the speaker sitting in the chair at the front of the room. Well, of course, there's no person, and this is far beyond human understanding. So of course, what happens is simply what happens. Nevertheless, if you follow my guidance, or if you sit in my energy for long enough, or whatever it might be, then it's more likely that this kind of seeing will arise. And I think that's, there's nothing wrong with that, there's nothing right with it. I'm just giving a description of quite a lot of the communication out there is about. And a phrase has just jumped into my head, which I think is quite commonly used in this case, and which I'm highly suspicious of. And the phrase is, of course, well, however it's put, let's use the word enlightenment, which is a very dodgy word, but I'll use it here. Of course, enlightenment is an accident, but doing practices make us more accident prone. That's a kind of quite a tricky suggestion, because it's saying on the one hand, of course we acknowledge there is nothing that can be done by the individual about this, because this is so far beyond the individual. Nevertheless, I can give you a practice which is going to make it more likely that this saying will arise. It's quite a sophisticated sophistry in a way, that's what I'd say.
One reasoning I heard about that was some people say that it seems like if you look at the numbers, usually you'll find more people who, it happened to more people who were already somehow involved.
Yeah, that may or may not be the case. We don't know. That's a kind of an assumption that's made. Certainly it happens where there has been no involvement whatsoever in anything spiritual or non-dual. Now, I'm perfectly well aware if you want a story to explain that, it's very easy. Then you just go for rebirth and karma. I mean, that's what the teacher who is devoted, who wants to teach a path and a practice and make that meaningful, may then say, well, yes, the person for whom the seeing of liberation arose, that's a ridiculous phrase because it didn't happen for the person, but nevertheless, that person, it arose, they did no spiritual practice in this life, you see, but it was because of their good karma from previous lifetimes of spiritual practice. So the mind can always think of a story to justify anything. Always, always, always. And in essence, it's actually very, very simple. The fact is that none of the stuff that I've just been talking about for a little while is knowable. It's really as simple as that. It simply isn't knowable. And I think that one of the things that can happen, even just with that split second of seeing that I talked about before, one of the reasons it can have in itself such a powerful effect is because the person, the mind, whatever we want to call it, may suddenly realise that all sorts of things that they thought were knowable and could become known are actually not knowable. They're simply not knowable. And so when the mind realises that, it can kind of let go of a lot of its agonising. I mean, one of the things that can happen with this is there can be a kind of a profound relaxation. And partly what that relaxation may be about, certainly for some individuals, is just the mind suddenly just giving up on all that searching, not because it's found something, but because it realises that what it is trying to find, the answers that it's trying to find, are unknowable. And once the mind really gets that it's unknowable, it can just lose interest. So in a sense, all of the kind of, I'm going to call them magical stories, all the kind of magical spiritual stories that are there in the traditions, we could explain those by it's the mind's desperate desire to have an answer, and so it makes up answers to that which can never be known, to things which can never be known.
I think some of these books that talk about self-inquiry, although they say that it doesn't guarantee anything, there's no it could never happen for a person even if they do it, but some of them say that that's what it's trying to point towards, that to see the limitation of your mind.
Yeah.
So I don't know if such practices they work, or it seems like you are not in that you don't like the idea of cause and effect
in that way.
Yeah. But if there is like an indirect cause.
Okay, I'll say something. I think, I hope it'll be fairly simple about practices. I mean, my attitude to practices of any kind, really, is that they may or may not be therapeutically helpful. Now, when I say therapeutically helpful, I mean got nothing to do with what we're talking about here, but many of us as individuals, we go through a certain amount of pain, maybe even agony, perhaps, on a psychological and emotional level. There are psychotherapeutic practices, spiritual practices, physical practices, which may be therapeutic in the sense that they relieve some of that suffering. So if we're doing a practice and it's psychologically helpful or therapeutically helpful, it's great, absolutely wonderful. Go on doing it, that's wonderful. Another reason for doing a practice may be that it's enjoyable. I mean, I did a form of meditation for about 30 years. At the time, I found it therapeutically beneficial. Looking back from now, I'm not sure that I'd stick with that, but at the time, that's what I would have said. And I also found it enjoyable. So I think, in a way, we can philosophize on a very abstract and abstruse level about this question of practices, self-inquiry, etc., 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 mindfulness, and so forth. I think, in a way, we could just cut through all of that and say, well, who cares? So what? If you enjoy it, do it. If it's beneficial to you, it relieves some emotional or psychological pressure. That's great. Then do it. That's fine, wonderful. We could also, of course, cut through the bullshit about practices in a different way by just noticing, going back to the kind of the non-dual dialogue that we're having, and just noticing that in any case, no one is choosing to do a practice, and no one is choosing to reject a practice. So a practice will simply happen, or it won't happen. I mean, to put that in more ordinary terms, if there's an individual sitting there, if some kind of interest or energy or magnetic attraction arises there to practice self-inquiry, then that may well happen. And if that interest doesn't arise there, then it probably won't happen. And we could cogitate for hours, days, weeks about why that attraction has or has not arisen, but that's just speculation. Like most of what the mind goes in for on an abstract level, we could just say, well, it's just baseless speculation. It can never be known. And in the meantime, life apparently goes on. So self-inquiry will happen or it won't happen. Meditation will happen or it won't happen. Becoming a Catholic and going to communion will happen or it won't happen. And it has nothing to do with who you think you are or who I think I am. So, in a way, that's how I would try to sort of cut through this endless discussion about practice, because it can go on endlessly and it can become very tedious, very abstract.
You don't seem to use words like consciousness, awareness. Is there a reason?
Well, I do use words like consciousness and awareness sometimes, because I think there are certain aspects of experience that it's very, very difficult to talk about if you don't use words like consciousness and awareness. But when it comes to what, the kind of baseline, what we're talking about here, I think they can be very confusing. Because let's go back to some of the most basic things we could say. There is only what's happening. Right? This is it. This is the entirety of what's happening. Get a tiny bit more sophisticated about what that means. Yes, I was saying that if I'm talking about psychological or psychotherapeutic or philosophical matters, I might use those words, because there's certain things it's very difficult to talk about unless you use those words. But in terms of what we're talking about here, I would say that the word consciousness and awareness, those words are, very confusing and give rise to an enormous number of quite misleading stories. And these stories relate back to what we were talking about before, about practices, because as soon as we start talking about awareness and consciousness, the next step is we might be talking about methods for raising our level of consciousness or raising our level of awareness, and before long we might find that we have 100 levels of consciousness or 1,000 levels of consciousness, and we have really spiraled out into what is quite a mad story, actually. So the problem with these words, if we go back to sort of a very basic statement, you know, all there is this: there is only what is happening. That's all. There's only what is happening. Well, what does that mean? What's happening? Well, experience is whatever experience is happening. That's all there is. What do you mean by experience? Phenomena. You know, the sound of a voice, the seeing a hand waving about, the texture of skin. Let's say those are phenomena. So all there is experience, right? Now, as soon as we start talking about consciousness and awareness, we've introduced the idea that there needs to be something separate from experience, in which experience can happen. And that something is a kind of, I don't know what we might call it, a sort of spiritual sea or effluvia of consciousness or awareness. So because there is consciousness or awareness prior to experience can arise. We've just introduced a completely unnecessary complication, but not just an unnecessary complication, but an unnecessary complication which will give the mind one of the things it most loves, which is an opportunity then to tell a very increasingly complicated story. You know, there's experience. That is what is known. It's the only thing that's known. Nothing is known other than phenomena. Does phenomena require a sea of consciousness to arise in, or a personal consciousness to arise in, or whatever? Well, there's certainly no evidence for it. It's just a complication that the mind adds. And in a way, the mind adds that complication because with the simplicity of there's just experience, there's very little the mind can do with that. You know, the mind wants to create a complicated story. You can't create much of a complicated story out of, well, it's just this, it's just whatever's happening. Oh no, there isn't just whatever's happening, there's also the consciousness within which it's happening. Right, now I've got that idea, I can found a spiritual school, and I can attract students and I can teach them the 7 levels of consciousness or the 40 levels of consciousness. I believe, I don't watch a lot of YouTube, but I believe that at the moment out there on YouTube, there is quite a popular idea that there are 1,000 levels of consciousness. Well, maybe there are. If there are, I'm probably on about level 4, I would imagine. It's just, another example of the way that mind absolutely delights in creating these ever more complicated stories, because in a way that keeps the game of the mind going.
So it's best to leave it at that it's unknown.
Well, it's not better or best. It's not good. It's not good to go along with what I'm saying and bad to go along with what somebody else is saying. It's simply the case, if you like. There is just experience. There is just phenomena. If we feel the need to add to that the idea that experience has to arise in something called consciousness, that in itself is just another experience. It's just another phenomena.
You may know that there are so many different views within non-duality. There are so many different views among different speakers, including the ideas of seeking or not seeking, to having some kind of tools like meditation or self-inquiry. How do you recognize if some of them, especially if you're a new person, how do you recognize if some of these messages are incomplete or incorrect?
I don't think there's any answer to that question. The apparent individual seems to choose to go to a particular speaker, if they do, for a particular reason. That's just an appearance. In fact, what's actually happening is again, experiences, phenomena are arising, and that part of that experience might be that this particular body-mind organism, this particular individual finds themselves at that speaker or at this speaker. When they're there, there's an attraction, or there isn't, and if there isn't, they don't go back. You know, again, it's just phenomena happening. It has no importance. I mean, I am very well aware that a lot of heat and probably not much light is generated by kind of fairly abstract philosophical discussions about what is right and what is wrong in non-duality, and I am certainly guilty of playing my part in that. You know, I've written 4 books on non-duality, I've made quite a lot of YouTube videos, so I'm probably as guilty as anybody else, but it is completely unimportant. It is utterly, utterly trivial. It really doesn't matter, you know.
What about I don't have a better word for this, but an enlightened person. What are like some of the misconceptions about an enlightened person?
Well, I think the first and basic misconception is that there is such a thing as an enlightened person. So I think, you know, let's sort of kill that one off straight away. I mean, by definition, you know, if there is a sense of personhood, you know, enlightenment is a really tricky word. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I, and I think probably quite a lot of other writers and speakers, tend to avoid it as much as possible, because it carries such a weight of history, tradition, expectations, and false ideas. So I think that's the first thing to do, is to get rid of the idea that there's such a thing as an enlightened person. I don't even like to say that there is such a thing as enlightenment, because enlightenment sounds like, you know, a state, you know, and there are only, in a sense we say there are only processes. There are no states, there are only processes. So that's the first thing. I'd throw out that entire concept totally. I mean, when you look at the literature, you can see the kind of ridiculous ways the mind goes mad around this concept. I mean, a few years ago, there was a non-duality sort of online magazine, and they invited contributions from people to talk about, you know, what did this phrase mean? You know, what is an enlightened person? What are the characteristics of an enlightened person? And they posed various questions and suggested, you know, people write in with an answer. So I wrote an article for them, and I think, you know, I kind of read their questions and I sort of paraphrased them in my own way. And perhaps I was being unfair, but, you know, one of the questions I felt they were really asking, but they didn't put it this way, would an enlightened person wear lipstick? In other words, you know, would an enlightened person, you know, would they still have some trace of vanity about them, whereby they would care about what people, you know, it kind of gets kind of that ridiculous. So I think that's what not what we need to do, it doesn't matter, but if we're trying to communicate clearly about this stuff, the first thing to do is just throw out of the window that concept of an enlightened person, or even an enlightened state. Yeah, and now I've completely forgotten what the question was that set me off with that. It was like about the characteristics. Misconceptions
about, an enlightened person,
yeah.
What they look like.
That's it, you know, in a way, that's it, you know, no such thing. But then the mini misconceptions underneath that is, you know, if there is the misconception that there's an enlightened person, they will behave in a certain way, they will have certain feelings and not other feelings. That kind of thing. They will be above preferences. They won't care what happens to them. You know, they won't care whether they get their morning cup of coffee or not, because they will be above such trivial things. They will be above anger, greed, lust, and so forth. All of these are the kind of obvious misconceptions. Am I allowed to get a little bit psychological now about this? Okay. So, I mean, I would see, I do have a psychological background, I can't help thinking in these ways. So I would see this, you know, this is all, everything I just talked about, it's all a result of a very, very basic habit of the human mind, which is to project. So we project onto others that which we do not see in ourselves. So if I'm, let's say, spiritually inclined to go to gurus and teachers, then you could say that I'm projecting onto a guru figure out there a kind of perfection, an idealized version of the self, a kind of perfection which I fail to see in myself. And so I see in the guru perfect behavior, perfect morality, I don't know, whatever the hell these mean, perfect behavior, perfect morality, perfect character, depending on how strong that projection is, and it may be very, very strong indeed. No matter what the guru does, I will find a way of justifying it to myself. Some kind of cognitive dissonance will take place in there, and I'll somehow, so for example, if the guru tells everyone that they have to be celibate and says that they themselves are celibate, and this is absolutely essential so that the spiritual fluid should be able to rise up to the Sahasrara chakra or whatever, and then we discover that the guru, who has in fact been visiting the women's quarters and has got 16 lovers or whatever, if my projection is really, really strong, I will probably find a way of justifying that, of squaring that circle, right? If I don't do that, then I will probably turn against the guru in fury, denounce him for simply being an ordinary person, but then, because the projection's still going in me, I'll then leave the ashram and set off to find another guru who really does live up to the purity that I demand of them. These are very, very powerful. Projection is one of the most powerful forces in our psyche. Again, I don't think I can explain why, but there's something about even that kind of initial opening to this, where it's seen that this is empty and that that's empty, which can blow apart a lot of that psychological baggage. So I would never sit in this chair and say that I am free of projections. You would have to be a complete fool. Anyone who claims they are completely free of projections must be a complete fool to do that, because projections by their nature are unconscious. So I don't know whether I have unconscious projections, obviously, but I think for a lot of individuals where this opening has happened, it is quite obvious, a lot of projections that were there do become conscious and then fall away. So what I can say confidently is that for a lot of individuals, this seeing does do away with masses of projections. Who knows whether all of them? Nobody knows that, but masses of projections. And I think that's, if I could go on a little bit more, get a slightly more philosophical at this point, I think that's also the reason why so many stories of meaning and purpose are also seen through. Not necessarily, but usually, often, also seen through, even with just a split second of the seeing of emptiness. So if you think of the great stories of meaning and purpose that so many individuals live by which I mean the religious stories mostly, and the spiritual stories, those two mostly, but other philosophical stories as well. But let's just stick with the religions and the spiritual paths because they're kind of easier. A belief in these stories. Let's say, if I believe in the Holy Roman Catholic Church and the Pope is infallible and all of that, endless. I can only do that really because I'm making a massive projection onto the organisation and the personages and those lovely hats and red cloaks and so forth. They invite projection, and here I am giving it to them. But it's only possible to believe in stuff like that because of this enormous psychological projection. I know I'm going out on a limb here, and many people watching this may disagree with me, but I'm going to stick to my guns on this. So, split second of seeing, everything's empty. Oh my God, everything's empty. That includes the Pope, the cardinals, the Catholic Church. Everything's empty. Those projections can just be wiped out in half a second. It's one of the reasons why that you know, even an initial opening to this can produce a huge state of confusion, but also a huge state of clarity. Now, clarity is not seeing liberation, but clarity can be very freeing, because it can free us, using the conventional world, from these huge projections that we put on organisations and teachers and religious leaders and people like that out there.
You mean conceptual clarity?
I mean, in a way I do, but I think it goes deeper than that. I mean, clarity is not seeing, it's different, and obviously it is conceptual. The very word kind of implies that we're talking about it, but I think it can go deeper than that, because you see, projections themselves are not just conceptual. If they were just conceptual, they'd be much easier to get. Well, obviously they're not conceptual because they're unconscious. So we could say they're not even conceptual. So if you really pin me down on this, I probably won't be able to make it any clearer. But, you know, clarity isn't seeing, but it's more than just conceptual. You know. So there can be this. I mean, let's say I'm following a guru very devotedly, or I'm a very devoted member of a church or something like that. Split second of seeing, oh my God, all of that can be over. It may not be, but it could all be gone in a second. And that can be, you know, very destabilizing in a person's life. You know, I've spent the last 40, 50 years going to Mass with deep devotion. Suddenly, it's not possible anymore. It could destabilize their relationships. I mean, if I've been following a guru for 30 years and my partner's been following the same guru, we're very devoted, we run an ashram perhaps for that guru, and then there's this opening and suddenly it's seen this is nonsense for one person, but their partner hasn't seen that. That can be very destabilizing, because suddenly the glue that held that relationship together for, let's say, 20 years, you know, that common devotion to the fact that we're serving humanity by serving our guru, isn't there anymore.
Are there apparent changes in a person after the liberation?
There may, when you say in a person, do you mean in the characteristics they manifest?
Yeah.
There may be. There may be. It's like, I mean, it can. I mean, for example, one of the things I often say is that in this opening, a lot of neurosis may drop away. I mean, it may not, but a lot of neurosis may drop away. If the person had been very neurotic and then there was this opening, that might be very obvious. You know, it might become very obvious afterwards that they were calmer, less neurotic, more secure, or whatever. If the person had not been very neurotic before this opening, then it might not make any apparent difference at all. You know. I mean, I've talked to people who, for example, don't seem to have any kind of sort of mental understanding of this, which obviously is completely irrelevant anyway, but who said to me, I don't understand what's happened, Richard. All I can tell you is I'm not depressed anymore. And I mean, there I'm quoting somebody who had probably at least 20, if not more, years of kind of low level but constant depression before that. So if something like that happens, it's quite likely that the people that know them may notice some kind of difference in them, some kind of lightening, you know, them becoming lighter. Yeah.
Is it still rare for liberation to happen, or do you think in most cases they are like partial awakenings?
Well, for the first part of that question, I don't think it's possible to answer. I mean, referring back to something you said earlier, yes, people will say it seems to be happening much more. I mean, there's this wonderful story, isn't there, that there's a great awakening happening to the planet. You know, that can then morph into this spiritual idea of a planetary ascension and so forth. So again, the mind loves stories like that. actually, there is just what's happening, and we could say, yeah, there seem to be more reports of awakening. Does that mean there are more awakenings? I don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how many awakenings there are where the individuals involved never talk about it because it's not their thing to talk. Nobody knows in the past how many there were. People didn't talk about it. I mean, in the past, certain quite long periods in the past, if you talked about awakenings, you would have been executed by the church. So it was probably quite wise not to talk about them. There are places today on the planet where if you talked about awakening, you'd probably be executed. So I just say it's an unanswerable question, and because it's unanswerable, it's not very interesting. What makes it interesting is if the mind gets hold of it as a story and says, there is this ascension coming, there is this great change coming, there is this great enlightenment on the planet. Then it becomes an interesting story. But it's just a story. We're still left with the simple reality that, there's just this.
If someone doesn't ever had that glimpse, non-duality could sound like a belief system.
Absolutely, definitely, yeah.
How can one is it not possible to differentiate between non-duality and belief systems?
No, non-duality clearly can be a belief system. The story of non-duality can very clearly be a belief system, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't, so what? It doesn't matter. Again, it doesn't matter. Somebody has bought the belief system of the Roman Catholic Church. Somebody's bought a belief system of non-duality. Well, that's okay, so what? Can I go back? I might be being a bit controversial here, I'm not sure, but can I, having mentioned Jiddu Krishnamurti before, can I go back to him? I think he's a very interesting case. I mean, I'm purely speculating here. So, my speculation has two parts. One is I'm speculating that for him, separation as an individual never really fully happened. That kind of non-dual sense was always there, right? But he was brought up for many very significant years by the Theosophists, and he was, if you like, he was indoctrinated very strongly in the theosophical story of ascended masters, and that he was the coming world leader and the new Maitreya and so forth. So very, very strongly indoctrinated in these stories. At a certain age, I believe in his 20s, he totally rejected all of that. Good for him. He totally rejected it and said, more or less, this is nonsense. I am not the world leader. Da, 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 da. If you then sort of read something of his biography as he then goes through the rest of his life, obviously experiencing very, very non-ordinary experiences. You can call them what you like. You could call them Kundalini awakening experiences or spiritual experiences, or it doesn't matter, but going through these experiences, it seems to me from his account of what was going on for himself that he was never able to free his mind completely from that theosophical conditioning. I'm not saying I'm right about that, I may well be wrong, but it seems to me that he was always looking for an explanation of the phenomena that he was going through, very profound, and in some cases disturbing phenomena that he was going through, and that those explanations that he was looking for always seemed to come to him in a kind of way in terms of this heavy propaganda and conditioning that he'd received from the Theosophists. That he was somehow a vehicle for the Maitreya, a vehicle for some great cosmic being or whatever. None of which has any importance, but I find it's just kind of interesting.
But is that possible where, although liberation is not an experience, it gives rise to experiences of a new dimension?
Well, I wouldn't say it gives rise to to experiences of a new dimension. I mean, liberation, you know, this almost meaningless word, I'm going to keep going back to saying it means virtually nothing other than, you know, it is the seeing that there is no self. And all there is whatever is arising. But having said that, you know, whatever is arising, well, anything could arise, and if the conditioned mind is still going, which it might, well, not if it is, it will be in some ways going, but if that conditioned mind is still producing, you know, these stories of meaning, of the kind that I'm talking about with the Theosophists, then those will still arise. No judgment about that. It doesn't matter. It's fine. You see, the mind might make a judgment about that. So if the mind's got interested in something which might be called pure non-duality, you know, the purest of the pure, the story-free non-duality, then the mind might then be critical of that and say, oh, surely theosophical stories should not continue to arise in such a great liberated being. Well, why the hell not? You know, these are all, I mean, the mind makes endless assumptions, and once we've got away from the practical, you know, like, you know, if I follow the instructions in the recipe book, I might bake a nice cake. Once we've got away from that, you know, a lot of what the mind gives rise to is endless nonsense.
In our generally in our society, it's commonly accepted that the more you know, the more intelligent you are. The more information you have. Did that change for you when this happened?
That's a difficult question. You see, I was a rather peculiar individual, you know, born into the 20th century in a Western country, because again, like a lot, but still a minority of other individuals of my generation, I stepped off that path. You know, that was definitely what we were brought up with. You know, you know, exactly as you described it. But you know, I grew into manhood in the terrible 60s or the wonderful 60s. And there was something about that which, in kind of cultural terms and social terms, really was genuinely liberating, with a small L, you know, sex and drugs and rock and roll, you know, and setting out to India to find ourselves and so forth. So we kind of, some of us sort of stepped off that path and decided quite early on that it wasn't like that, that intellect and reason and so forth might have their place, but there was this other dimension that we were searching for truth through. And many of us, and I was very lucky that I was not one of these, I would say, you know, many of us that did that completely trashed their everyday lives in order to go to India and find God or the Guru or whatever. You know, people gave up very, very promising careers and went off to India and spent years there and eventually became disillusioned. Some of them not. I don't know. For me, it wasn't like that. I managed to find a guru to follow that it was possible to follow without having to, you know, trash ordinary everyday life and, you know, go and live in the Himalayas and live off rice. And
now I want to ask you about my question is, if non-duality, if there is a tendency for it to devalue the facts of an illusion, and I'm giving an exaggerated example. For example, if everything is illusion, one may argue that so Earth could be flat or Earth could be round. So it's all an illusion, and devaluing the fact of what's actually happening. Do you think there's a tendency for non-duality?
The first thing I'd say to that is that I do not use the word illusion in that sense. So, you know, in a way, I can't answer that question because that's not what I say. I think the word illusion is tricky what it actually means is that something is different to how it appears to be. So if we're strict about that, then it's perfectly fine as a description to say that this is an illusion, but that is not what most people hear. If you say that this is an illusion, what most people hear is you're saying this is not real, and therefore it doesn't matter. And I think that's, in a way, that's where your question is coming from. So I would never say this is an illusion, inviting that a misconception. What I like, this is not my original description, but it's a phrase I like, is that this is both real and unreal. It is both real and unreal. So, this is in a way just another kind of mind game thing, but if the mind wants to get its teeth into this, and so the mind might say very challengingly, so you telling me that, it doesn't matter that I've got really painful toothache? Well, the answer to that is this is both real and unreal. The extent to which your toothache is real matters. It's both, it's not one or the other. So I think the word illusion is unhelpful because it is far more often misunderstood than understood. Yeah.
And another idea that goes with around that concept is the idea of that thoughts are illusion.
Yeah.
So would that mean that all perceptions are false?
No, I'd just give exactly the same answer. Perceptions are both real and unreal. And if somebody wants to claim, no, they are purely unreal, well, they're welcome to do that as an intellectual game, but we know it is just an intellectual game because they don't step off the curb in front of the bus. So the extent to which we do not step off the curb in front of the bus unless we want to commit suicide, that is the extent to which this is real as well as unreal. It's both. The mind loves, one of the reasons the mind loves these sorts of, abstruse and abstract philosophical things like, sophistry, like, I am the only one who exists and no one else and nothing else. One of the reasons the mind loves this is because it can play games with it endlessly on that abstract level. It cannot play a game on the concrete level. On the concrete level, the mind will not step in front of the bus, no matter how many treatises it has just written in its university study, proclaiming that the bus is not real. This is, I'm talking all the time, in a way it's misleading because I'm talking all the time as if the person and the mind is real, which of course it isn't. So if we take it back a little bit, we say, this is a psychophysical system. It is a real and unreal psychophysical system, and to the extent to which it is real, it has programs running in it dedicated to its survival. So it does not step off the curb in front of a bus until another program dedicated to killing itself might emerge, So if this psychophysical system was sort of running a program which was deeply suicidal, then it would step off the curb perhaps in front of a bus. But that's got nothing to do with some sort of idealized belief system that the bus isn't real and that this isn't real. But for most of us, most of the time, one of the most powerful impulses that's running all the time in this psychophysical system is self-preservation. No mystery about that. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. We wouldn't have evolved as beings if it wasn't for that.
When you give meetings about non-duality, do you think usually people get it, or sometimes does it get mistaken for therapy or personal growth kind of things?
Well, I don't know about people getting it. I think with the meetings that I give, I hope and I think it does not get mistaken for personal growth or therapy. because I probably rather deliberately avoid that.
So if someone asks you if there is a practical use for non-duality, you would, there's
there are, I would go so far as to say this, there are tendencies for certain changes to take place when non-duality is seen, right? And some of those changes may be beneficial for the life of the apparent character, for the life of the apparent person that continues to, you know, on the planet, as it were. So I could go as far as that, but I mean, it's so what, you know, I want to, the reason I'm hesitating, I'm wanting to use the phrase "it's out of our control," but that phrase is so inadequate because there is no us to be in control anyway, you know. But yeah, you could say that certain characteristics could change and that could be beneficial. But then remember, you know, one of the things that Tony Parsons says, is that this ruins your life. And in a way it does. Not necessarily just in the sense that it reveals that you don't have a life because you don't exist. So going back to something I said earlier, you know, it can ruin relationships. It really can. It can ruin friendships. It can ruin what you do in daily life. I know people who've been asked to leave their meditation groups because they've started talking about non-duality, and it doesn't fit with what the leader or the teacher or the guru is saying. I know people whose relationships have become very difficult because their partner simply doesn't get why they've lost interest in so many things that they used to have in common. So if there was anything we could do about this, or if there was anyone who could do anything about it, there should be huge warning signs over non-duality meetings, you know, abandon hope, all ye who enter here, and another one saying this can ruin your life, and another one saying non-duality can be dangerous to your relationships, you know, like the sort of warnings you get on cigarette packets.
But that could also be something that's happening in a story.
Of course, oh yeah, everything that I'm saying here is something that's happening in a story, of course, yeah. That's kind of understood, sort of throbbing away underneath all this communication. Of course this is all a story. We're using words here, we're exchanging ideas and using words, of course it's a story, yeah. The one thing I would add to that, however, I claim, rightly or wrongly, that of course, just like Roman Catholicism, or you know, any religion, any philosophical school or whatever, of course non-duality is also a story. But I claim that non-duality is the mother of all stories. And the reason it's the mother of all stories is because it's the story with the least complexity added to it. So as soon as you get above that base level of non-duality, you have to start adding complexity. So if you think about, I mean, I know that Hinduism is not a kind of sort of monolithic religion, but you know, let's just use that phrase for the many, many paths and religions that it embraces, you see. So you look at the complexity of Hinduism and the Hindu gods, which, you know, much of which I love, by the way. I absolutely love it. You know, who could not be entranced by Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, or, you know, Hanuman, the monkey god, and dancing Shiva, and Kali with the skulls. It's wonderful. It's all so rich and so forth. But you cannot get, as soon as you start building another story on top of the foundation story of non-duality, you have to start adding whistles and bells. You have to start adding teachers and gurus and wise beings and maybe gods and angels and seraphs and practices and meditations and prayers and fate and karma and heaven and hell, and you know, you see what I mean? So yeah, non-duality is a story, but it's the mother of all stories.
Do you think the idea, I'm getting a little off topic here, but do you think the idea of guru is becoming outdated?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. In a way it is, yeah. And I think maybe the internet's done that for two reasons. I mean, I entered my spiritual teaching, I'll rephrase, I'll say that correctly. I entered my spiritual searching days prior to the internet. You know, information was not that easy to come by. There were 2 or 3 very big, well-known gurus, which we would tend to be attracted to one or the other, depending on their personality and practices and so forth. All that's gone now, of course. You know, we could, you know, anyone can. I don't even need a computer. I take out my mobile phone. I've got access to information and talks by 1,000, if not 10,000 gurus, depending on how we define a guru, instantly. So that's one thing. There's a great deal of competition now. The other thing, of course, is that when the guru gets up to mischief, which they may well do, it's very, very difficult to keep that hidden. Very difficult. So I take out my mobile phone and I've instantly got access to the latest scandal about Muji, or the latest what's going on with Andrew Cohen, or the latest whatever. So and the existence of the internet makes it, you know, very easy to sort of propagate some what might sound like another unique spiritual story, but it's really just a slight twist on an old spiritual story. Makes it much easier to propagate it. So if I become fascinated with the idea of developing 1,000 levels of consciousness, it would take me right now approximately 15 seconds to find a school that will take money off me to teach me how to rise through those 1,000 levels of consciousness. So I think that tends to kind of, you know, it tends to sort of go against the kind of the old-fashioned, you know, there are just these few gurus sitting there in their mighty chairs, and that's who you go to, yeah.
And sometimes social media can create that echo chamber for you. When you look into one of those topics, it will keep on recommending something related.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And so, you know, people might become popular with astonishing speed, and then when they're caught in some hypocrisy or other, which will usually be sexual, they can be brought down with astonishing speed as well. And then, of course, they can reinvent themselves as well. You know, they can go off. I don't know if I should say this, and I don't know if you might cut it out, but I mean, you know, this is what Andrew Cohen's done. Not that I'm accusing him of any particular shenanigans, of course not. But nevertheless, you know, he became very popular. Then he was kind of brought down for whatever reasons, which I'm not going to go into. And now he's reinvented himself, and, you know, has a lovely, bright new website and is offering spiritual teachings again. So, you know, anything. So it's all part of the game, you know, it's all, I mean, you know, I think it's very rich and very entertaining, and I love it, you know. I mean, I have my own character, obviously, and part of my character, like many other people, if not most people, is that, you know, I love gossip. Most people do, whether they admit it or not. You know, gossip is kind of the, you know, very, very vital and necessary for social interaction. So actually, most of us like gossip. But you know, so some lovely, colourful stories go on out there, you know, and it's kind of great theatre. And people get very incensed. I mean, another aspect of this, which I'll throw in here, is, of course, there's an awful lot. Many people are very, very moralistic, and so it's wonderful. You know, some lama who's whether they proclaim themselves to be celibate or not, some lama who is, you know, discovered to have been, you know, having love affairs with 20 of their followers or whatever, or some guru, you know, the kind of thing. It's so kind of, I mean, I don't watch much television, you know, I don't like I don't know if they have the same term in America. I don't like watching soap operas and things like that, you know, but this is kind of real life soap opera. It's entertaining. It's kind of something very colourful about it.
It's like a reality show.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, but much more interesting. Again, I don't watch reality shows, but it's kind of endless. The world of spiritual teachers and lamas, and endlessly fascinating. And partly what makes it so rich is the fact that, as well as loving gossip, so many people are also very moralistic. And so, you know, whatever the guru or the lama has or has not done is likely to generate huge amounts of heat and fury, and that's very entertaining as well. Yeah.
You had some thoughts about morality and non-duality. Could you share a little bit on that?
I think morality, in a way, my starting point might be to say I think morality is highly suspect. And when I say that, in a way, I suppose I'm talking about moralism, which is a little bit different. So you could say, well, define morality however you like, but morality is moralism is a kind of, you know, heavy insistence that people should behave as I think they should behave. So moralism is full of shoulds and oughts, and particularly condemnation. So I do have a particular kind of dislike of that. I very, very strongly mistrust people who are highly moralistic, you know, who are waggy-fingered, you know, you ought, you should, you shouldn't, you mustn't do that, you should do that. Very, very suspicious of where that's coming from. A few things about that. One thing I don't like about it is I think it's a very lazy way of trying to seize the moral high ground and make out that somehow I am better than you in my behaviour. You know, so I do that by utterly condemning people that step out of line. Yeah, I don't laugh. I mean, I don't laugh about it. I don't find it amusing theatre. I condemn it with a very waggy finger. So that's one thing. I think it's just a very lazy way of seizing the moral high ground and saying somehow that I am morally superior to other people. The other thing I don't trust about it is I think it's probably has a huge amount of projection in it, and particularly if the person involved is a kind of spiritual or religious leader, if they're very moralistic, it might be a very good clue that they are up to no good when their flock is not looking. So, you know, in the simplest possible terms, you could say, you know, that the most homophobic preacher is probably the one who is going to rent boys. The one who is most severely condemning adultery is probably the one that has a few mistresses. So I think there are very, very good reasons to be highly suspicious of moralism. Yeah. Morality itself, it might be best to avoid that, because if we start talking about that, that can become so abstruse and philosophical, and you know, and in the end, not terribly interesting.
Hypothetically speaking, if you would restart your seeking journey all over again, what are some of the things you would avoid? What are the mistakes?
I don't think anything. No, it was fun. No, I don't think I'd do anything differently. I mean, sitting here, apparently, you know, as a sort of seeing that it was kind of theatre. You know, some of it was enjoyable, some of it was painful. The pain probably couldn't be avoided. No, I can't think of any level on which I could make a kind of any other sort of, you know, intelligent answer to that question. You know, why would I want it to be different, and how would How would I want it to be different? I might say, well, it could have been more fun. Maybe some of the suffering involved could have been less, but no, not really. No.
So last time we did talk briefly about free will in our interview, but I had a couple of contradictions I would like to get your clarity on.
Let's see where that goes, yeah.
So the first one is, you have said that there is no free will, but you, on the other side, the name for this, when seeing happens, it's liberation.
Can I just clarify, by the way? I would claim, rather than saying there is no free will, I would claim that what I've said is there is no one who exercises free will. Now you might say, well, that comes to the same thing, but I think there's a bit of a difference there. But anyway, go on.
So on one hand, there's that concept, and on the other hand, there's this concept of liberation.
Yeah.
So it's which is freedom. So I think it's maybe you're referring to a different kind of freedom.
Yes.
If you could clarify.
I am, and I hope it's easy to clarify that. We'll see if it is, right? So that word freedom, well, we use it in more than two different ways, but essentially in two different ways, right? We talk about freedom to, so freedom to do stuff. So I am free to choose to do. I'm free to choose to go wherever I want to today for lunch. Let's make it really trivial. And then there's freedom from. Okay, so liberation has nothing to do with freedom to. It does not increase our freedom to choose where we go to lunch today. And obviously I'm challenging with what you said about free will. I'm obviously, and many other people are as well, I'm obviously challenging the whole idea that we are free even to choose where we to go to have lunch today. But we can forget about all that, because the freedom that we're talking about with non-duality is freedom from. There's all sorts of freedom froms. You know, if we went into the political sphere, we could talk about freedom from tyranny. If we went into the psychological sphere, we might talk about freedom from depression, let's say. In this case, what are we talking about freedom from? I would say freedom from the tyranny of the self, or the apparent tyranny of the self, because it is only apparent. So to me, I see no contradiction here whatsoever. It's just an understanding that these two, it's an unfortunate word in a way, freedom, because it is used in these two completely different ways. And if we don't understand that, we can become very easily confused, and also very easily bamboozled as well, by philosophers, politicians, etc. But we won't go there today. So yeah, there is. What is liberation? It's liberation from. If we don't like the phrase tyranny of the self, just make it really simple. Liberation is freedom from the self. Freedom from the apparent existence of the self. Yeah.
So you are not tied to that idea of wanting the free will, wanting to do.
Oh, I think free will is an absolute non-starter on so many different levels. Okay, so in a way, it's kind of very obvious why most people believe in free will, because that is most people's everyday experience. Right? In another sense, it's rather a puzzle that people do believe in free will, because it's very easy to dismantle free will as an idea. And it's actually, you can dismantle it in 3 different ways, and I think any one of those ways demolishes free will, and we've got 3 of them. So, the first way, you can demolish free will philosophically, and it's a fairly simple argument, and I don't want to go into it really because it would probably be quite boring, but essentially the philosophical argument, we could say, well, either everything is determined or it isn't. Everything in the universe is determined or it isn't. If everything is determined, there is clearly no space for free will, because everything that happens is totally caused by things that have happened before that, right? If everything in the universe is not completely determined, then there's only, one other possibility, which is that some things in the universe are random, some events are random. It's the only possibility is either an event's determined or it's random. So everything's determined, or most things are determined and some things are random. But randomness doesn't introduce free will. I mean, if I perform an action which has happened, at random, that in no sense gives me free will. If I perform an action which is entirely determined, that in no sense gives me free will. I mean, that's a fairly clumsy and very brief summary of the argument. It's out there if people sort of want to go for it. But that's the philosophical approach. Now, of course, in the 21st century, we have a very interesting scientific approach, which is that neuroscience is actually demonstrating that we don't have free will. And again, I don't want to go in any depth into the experiments, but very, very briefly, through advances in neuroscience, we can show that when somebody thinks that they've chosen an action volitionally, in other words, they believe that they have exercised their own free will, in actuality, the processes in the brain which lead to that action happening occur before they become consciously aware of making a choice. So what science is showing us is that the brain, let's say unconsciously and therefore without free will, makes a decision that a certain action will happen, and then after that comes the conscious thought, I am choosing to do this. I am choosing to raise my left hand rather than my right hand. So that's the scientific approach. Then, of course, the third way in which free will may be demolished is through the direct seeing of non-duality. Now, anyone can follow the science, anyone can follow the philosophy. The seeing of non-duality is, who knows, let's say in the lap of the gods, if we want to say that. But nevertheless, when there is non-dual seeing, it just becomes obvious that there can't be free will because there is no person who could operate free will. And I mean, I think that message has been there, hidden or not so hidden, in the communications of mystics throughout the ages. And it's one of the reasons that mystics are rarely understood, because the one who feels himself to be a person with such things as choice and free will operating cannot understand what the mystic is saying. He just can't understand it. But I would say, there's just no room for free will anymore. But don't expect this to become a popular notion amongst the population in general, because in general we cling in a very addictive fashion to my sweet precious identity as an individual, and a very essential part of that identity is that I get to choose what I do. That's a very, very precious idea. And in fact, actually, in a way, a very quick way of making someone angry may be to suggest to them that they don't have a self. And another very quick way to make someone angry may be to suggest to them that they don't have free will.
My another point on this was, you have talked about in non-duality how reality is unknown and it's unknowable. So how do we know for sure, even the idea of free will, maybe even that is unknown? Maybe we can't know for sure.
We can't know what for sure about free will?
Whether free will exists or does not. Well,
I mean, all I can do is rest on the three things that I've already said, and I can say, and obviously this is a mind, the question comes from the mind, the answer comes from a mind back to a mind, so all I can do is assert, that those three arguments demolish free will. all I can really add to that is, and I mean, I feel like I've said this several times during this interview, and I don't want it to sound dismissive, but in a way it is kind of quite important, but in a way, and who cares? Because we're back to what happens is what happens. So if a belief in free will arises, so what? That's okay. If a belief that free will does not happen arises, well, that's okay, so what? You know, we don't, in other words, the mind is always looking for something to grip onto to keep itself going. So it's kind of looking for a fight, an argument, a philosophical dispute, loves that sort of thing. It keeps it going, keeps it kind of believing in its own existence. That's all a bit of a metaphor, obviously. And actually we can sit back and say, well, yes, but so what? So what? The importance of free will as an idea, of course, I mean, one of the reasons people cling to it so desperately is because, in a way, all systems hang on it. So all our religious belief systems, all our spiritual belief systems, all our philosophical belief systems, our political belief systems, our belief systems about progress, for example, or even possibly about lack of progress, you know, our belief systems about enlightenment, not in the spiritual sense, but in the kind of sense of the enlightenment of a society, an enlightened society, scientifically and philosophically, they all rest on the belief in free will. Free will is a very important cornerstone. You take away free will, you've just destroyed the Catholic Church. You've just destroyed the Protestant churches. You've just destroyed Islam. You've just destroyed Judaism. You've just destroyed karma. So you've just destroyed Buddhism and Hinduism, in a way. I mean, not all of that, because there are some pretty sophisticated thinkers in all of those, but they're very much a minority. You've really destroyed everything apart from the mystical apprehension. And the mystical apprehension is both very simple and impossible to understand. It's possible to see it, but it's not possible to understand it. So when my favourite Christian saint, when my favourite Christian mystic, who was executed by the church for her mysticism, said, and I may be paraphrasing slightly, said, until I see that I am nothing, I cannot see that I am everything. She is giving what to me sounds like an absolutely perfect description of the seeing of non-duality. Now, if I'd come across that when I was a spiritual seeker, I could not have made any sense of it whatsoever. But as soon as this is seen for what it is, that makes perfect sense.
How do we know for sure that when this seeing happens, it's not like a change of a focal point of the me to a focal point of the universe, and maybe it's still not a full nature of the reality. Maybe.
Yeah.
So how would we know for sure?
Well, the problem with the question, I think, is sort of some of the concepts in it, like a full, whatever word you use, a full apprehension of reality or whatever. I mean, that's a mind concept. So it's very difficult to answer that question. It's a very natural question for the mind to answer. And I mean, if, as I sometimes am, I have put myself, as it were, in the position of being a speaker at the front of a room, and people sitting in the audience are asking a question like that. It's a very reasonable question. It's very proper for the mind to ask it. The problem is there isn't an answer which could possibly satisfy the mind. All I can do is sit here and say again, I'm trying to give a description of something. I'm not trying to prove anything or argue anything. Not about non-duality. I mean, I might sound like I am quite argumentative about, for example, the hypocrisy of certain gurus. But when non-duality, I'm not trying to argue anything. I'm just trying to give a description. So the mind might well say, well, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. I want you to prove to me what you are saying. And all I can say to that, well, I could say different things to that. One of the obvious things I could say is wait and see. Wait and see, as Tony often says, ring me up when it happens. And the other thing we might notice is it is almost the mind's job to find objections to stuff, to find ways of arguing and objecting. And for example, for me, when I first started to go to see Tony, my mind had masses of questions. I would ask masses and masses and masses of questions. And eventually, after quite a long time, these questions began to die down. But the important point to make, I think, is they didn't start to die down because they were satisfactorily answered. They started to die down because the mind began to realise they would never be answered and they could never be answered. So one of the ways the mind keeps itself going, if it has a certain philosophical character, is by endless speculation about the nature of the universe, the individual, life, experience, God, spirit, and so forth. The reason these concepts are so good for keeping the mind going is because there is no answer. None of them can ever possibly come to a full stop with a satisfactory answer, so they can keep the mind going forever. So the mind will never get answers to these unanswerable questions. What happens? Oh, tell me, Master, what happens after death? For example, oh, tell me, Master, what is the nature of ultimate liberation? The mind will never get answers to these questions, which is why they're such good questions, because they can feed the mind forever. So eventually what can happen when there becomes an interest, in the absolute simplicity of this, is that the mind there's no volition in this, it's just that it so happens that for a certain number of minds that energy can simply give up, and it gives up partly because it begins to realise that these questions will not be answered, and more importantly cannot be answered. I don't know, I'll use this metaphor, I don't know if it'll work, I've used it before. To me it's like, I started getting interested in non-duality, I started asking lots of questions. It's like, each question I asked, I was like a mountaineer hammering a peg up into the cliffside, right? And the idea was, I would get the answer to that question, it would be a peg, and then I would use it, I would pull myself up the mountain a little bit, so I have a little bit more understanding. Then I'll ask another question and put another peg. That would be another peg. So by getting the answers to these questions, I would slowly ascend the mountain of knowledge or the mountain of enlightenment or whatever. That kind of worked with gurus and teachers. It worked in all sorts of areas. I'm confronted by coming to non-duality meetings. It doesn't work anymore, because what happens is, I hammer a peg in by asking a question. When the answer comes, what happens is, with the answer, is that peg falls out of the cliff. So I'm trying to haul myself up on it, and I fall back down on my arse instead. Because these questions are, of course, in a way, they're very understandable, and in a way they're nonsense, and they're definitely unanswerable, except with myths and stories. Tell me, O great Guru, what happens after death? For example. That's a good one. That could keep the mind going for 40 years easily. So that's something that can happen. This can sound like a process, so I'm not suggesting that this is helpful. I'm just giving this as a description for myself, and I know also for other individuals I've talked to, that it's like after a while the mind just begins to give up. And I'm not suggesting that the mind giving up is better, but it's more relaxing. The mind agitating about these questions can create a lot of tension. So as the mind begins to get that it can never and will never understand these things, it may start to relax.
I think there is a loophole to that, because that is also a good answer for a mind in a way that there is no answer.
Yeah.
And now that becomes a concept. But I think what you're trying to say is non-duality is not saying that that's the answer.
Well, let me go back to the last thing I said then about the mind begins to relax. I think you're absolutely right, of course. This could be just another mind game. Very easily, the mind is it's such a cunning little monkey, and it's very, very subtle. But I think the clue to what may apparently be happening for the character is that relaxation. That as that relaxation takes place, that is not a mind thing and it's not a mind game. It's something which kind of affects the whole energy of the body. Now, I'm not suggesting a process here or a path or anything like that. I'm just describing what happened here and what I know happens in other cases. And I can't resist throwing in one of my favourite quotes at this point, which is from an English Tibetan Buddhist who translated a major Tibetan work, and in his introduction, towards the end of his introduction to this Tibetan holy spiritual work, he said, relaxation is the key to Buddhahood here and now. Beautiful, beautiful, you know.
How do you see, from non-duality perspective, how would you explain some of these ideas that are commonly talked about in spiritual circles, about near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences? Some people they see angels. Do you think there is some kind of similarities? Maybe there is some kind of commonalities among those spiritual experiences. How would you explain that?
Do you mean commonalities between them or with non-duality?
And some commonalities between non-duality.
Right, okay. No commonality whatsoever with non-duality. Non-dual seeing can happen when there's been no spiritual experiences like that. It can happen when there have been lots of spiritual experiences like that, so I wouldn't see any connection at all there. Going back to the first part of the question, I said these are just phenomena. They're clearly, it seems to me, as real as phenomena as drinking a cup of coffee. Let's use the rather neutral phrase non-ordinary experiences for all of us. I have certainly had non-ordinary experiences, so I know that they're real in that sense. I know other people who have had many, many more non-ordinary experiences than I have, and I absolutely trust their descriptions. In terms of understanding them, saying what they're about, as with everything else in a way, we can throw our hands up, which is the honest thing to say, and say, I don't know. Or we can make up a story about them, and we can have a kind of mind belief in that story. And probably whichever of those we do, or perhaps some other alternative, will depend on our individual character, you know, our programming, our conditioning, and that kind of thing. So I think ultimately all we can say is, stuff happens, and that stuff includes some pretty strange stuff. So earlier in this talk you mentioned lucid dreams, for example. Lucid dreams can be pretty weird, and there are far weirder things than that can happen. But then there's a lot of weirdness, you know. I mean, I don't want to make a fool of myself by even tentatively saying anything about quantum physics, but I just happen to be reading a book about quantum physics at the moment. I mean, without understanding it at all, of course, because nobody does. Nevertheless, the universe on a quantum level is pretty weird. That's, you know, we can assert there's a lot of weirdness around, you know, and that weirdness includes quarks, and it includes lucid dreams, and it includes visions, and all sorts of things. Stuff happens, and some of the stuff that happens is very weird. I mean, we cannot explain this. We can't explain a simple cup of coffee. We can't explain how we know now that this is just energy. It's just energy, and it's being held by this, which is just energy. We can't explain how it somehow manifests as apparent physical objects. How could we possibly explain, I don't know, a vision of an archangel, for example? It's just more stuff that happens. The brain is clearly a wonderful thing.
Will you say the same thing about when some people, this is especially a bit more closer to non-duality, because some of these people also talk about ego death during DMT experiences.
Yeah.
How would you make sense of that?
Well, I've talked to people, I mean, I've had some hallucinogenic drug experience myself. I've never taken DM, whatever the drug is. I've talked to people who have. I've talked to people, not many, but I've talked to people who would say, yes, they've had death experiences or whatever. I would just say that's just more stuff happening. I wouldn't try to draw any connection whatsoever. I would say that in my drug-taking years, I had one experience which at the time I would have described as deeply, deeply spiritual. I would say that I saw God. Don't ask me what that means, but I would say I saw God and I knew the purpose of the universe. And I had a kind of spiritual mind that was sort of attuned to that kind of interpretation. Now I just say, yeah, that was just another experience. It was just something else that was happening. So, yeah, I mean, weird shit happens even when the brain hasn't taken ayahuasca. You start feeding these substances into the brain and even weirder shit's going to happen. Yep, that's part of what happens. And I would say it has no more importance and no less importance again than this cup of coffee.
That is also seen as an experience.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's an experience, yeah. And then the mind will probably interpret that experience, and that interpretation is itself just another experience, because the mind is quite likely to tell a story about the experience. What's a story? It's another experience. Yeah.
Not much has talked about life after liberation, apparent life after liberation. Does it become more interesting or does it become boring?
I'd say neither. I mean, firstly, there's absolutely no rules. No rules at all. Anything can happen. But I've talked to a lot of people, and I'd say there are tendencies, and there are tendencies for neither of those things to happen. One thing which is very little, there's nothing you can say in an absolute sense as to what happens, but one thing which is very, very common is boredom ends. So you could say anything can happen when this is seen, but there are certain things it's very unlikely to happen. And other people have also talked about these things. It's unlikely that boredom will happen. It's unlikely that depression will happen. It's unlikely that loneliness will happen. They could happen, but they tend not to. I've lost track of the question now.
Does life become boring or interesting?
Or more, right, okay, so let's get back on track with that then. Right, so I'd say the tendency is very, very strongly that life does not become boring, and that if life was boring before, that ends, right? Maybe connected to that, I don't know. I would also say, depends what you mean by life becomes more interesting. I think what may happen is that we become maybe more interested and quite fascinated by very simple things. And so you could say in that sense, well, life becomes more interesting, like sitting with a cat, stroking the fur of a cat on your lap becomes more interesting because it's more immediate. But if you think in terms of what people really think of, usually with the mind as interesting, doing lots of stimulating, exciting things, I'd say the general tendency is that life becomes much quieter. So if you think a quiet life is not interesting, then you could say life becomes less interesting. Again, it's by no means always the case, but I've talked to a lot of people about this, and in general what seems to happen is that there is an impulse to lead a quieter life and not to really want to do very much, because it's like life itself, just the simplicity of what's happening in the everyday is just more immediate and more fascinating. Yeah, I had an email from a very old friend of mine who moved to Australia a long time ago. A couple of days ago he emailed me, and one of the things is that he is about to go into retirement, and he said he's worried about leading an inactive life. And he's been reading a book about, how when you retire you must remain very active or whatever. And I just think, no, leading an inactive life is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. And I know people, the common thing over here where people retire and then you meet them a year or two later or whatever, and they say, I've never been so busy, and since I retired I don't know how I had time to work, and they're doing this in the morning and that in the afternoon and ballroom dancing in the evening, and my heart kind of sinks, and I just think, oh no, I just, please give me a quiet life. Yeah, there is something about this where maybe just the mind or the system just requires less stimulation, perhaps. Yeah.
And that energy that it takes to keep the me alive.
Yeah, it's just so wonderful to kind of sit in. If I say sit in silence, it sounds like I'm advocating some kind of, deep spiritual meditation technique. I'm not, just to sit in silence, staring, looking at a wall. It can be just so wonderful. If the self isn't chewing itself, what makes that difficult for most of us is because the self is there chewing itself to pieces with its agonies about life.
You would be a good person to ask this one question, especially because you have so much experience in the spiritual seeking world, and you have seen how it was decades ago and how it's now. So one thing I've noticed, like in really old days, spirituality used to be all about being minimal, being simple, and really like no wealth, and almost like giving up everything you have.
Yeah.
And now it's all about law of attraction and attracting wealth, abundance. It went from like minimal to now like being wealthy and attracting abundance. How do you feel about that transition?
Well, it's from one story to another, isn't it? It's from one extreme story, we have to give everything up, to another extreme story, I have the power to manifest whatever I want to manifest in the universe. They're just shit stories, really. In case you don't want to put that line in, I'll say it again. They're both just stories. They're just, it's just the madness of the mind. You can see where they both come from in a way, but you can see where the first one comes from. The first one comes from the idea very prevalent in Eastern philosophies, of course. That life involves a lot of suffering, but somehow I, whatever that means, am attracted to living life over and over and over and over again, so we have the idea of rebirth in there, and that therefore to break free of the suffering I have to give up everything that keeps attracting me back into this life. So you have the path of asceticism. That's a kind of coherent story, if you want a story. I will say about that story what I will say about all other stories. It's unknowable. I'm not denying it, and I'm not assenting to it. I'm saying it's a story of the mind which is unknowable. And then I think it's brilliant that you pointed this out, of course, that now in the 20th, 21st century, we've gone this exact opposite story has become incredibly popular because it goes a little bit beyond the laws of attraction and the cosmic ordering service and things like that. It's like somehow my ability to create for myself and to attract to myself anything I want is a sign of my spiritual purity and my spiritual advancement. You know, so the fact that I want a Ferrari and I haven't yet attracted myself a Ferrari is a sign that I need more spiritual growth, because if I was really spiritually open, I would wake up to find I had the Ferrari that I wanted. It's lovely. It's such a lovely story. Obviously, of course, it's complete nonsense, but it's a lovely story. I don't want to get too social and political about this, but I would say it's the kind of natural spiritual parallel to the kind of mad neoliberal dog-eat-dog capitalist economics that we have. I could get into that, but I won't. I mean, in my personality, I can be quite political as well. But this isn't the point to go there. I'm just mentioning that because it seems it's like such a, it's so beautifully obvious that these two belong together. That, I mean, the stories of the laws of attraction. So I would just say that it's a terribly attractive story, particularly if I'm feeling disempowered. I feel I have no control over my life. But I can retreat into my own space and I can do these practices which will somehow magnetically attract what I want into my life. It's a kind of spiritual parallel to that kind of rampant capitalism. Yeah, it's another mind story, and the mind does like to push things to extremes. I mean, you could say, well, there's nothing wrong with it on a kind of, moderate level. It's sort of natural. I want something, so I perform actions to go out and get it. That's perfectly natural. But then, you push that story further and further and further. You make it more and more and more extreme, and you end up with a book like The Secret, and philosophies like the laws of attraction and so forth. Mind loves that stuff.
Do you see that?
It's a bit like positive thinking. The philosophy of positive thinking in psychology and psychotherapy and so on. There's something in me that really revolts against it. I hate these positive thinking books, and I love the books that kind of take those down. There's a wonderful book by Barbara Ehrenreich and another one by Oliver Burkeman that really take down this really powerful philosophy of you have to have positive thinking all the time. I just hate it. But there's nothing wrong with thinking positively, of course not. I mean, it's a perfectly fine thing to do. It's when these things are turned into, these stories which provide the answer to life. I think, oh no, please, let's go up to the park and look at a tree.
And how would you feel if, after law of attraction, non-duality is the next story?
In what sense?
In like from the gradual progression we talked about in spiritual hype, like from minimalism to law of attraction, and then
I think then we're back to the ultimate minimalism. I think if you look at the kind of the spiritual stories that we were talking about there, the asceticism and so forth, then we think of those as minimalist stories. Non-duality is really minimalist. I mean, that's probably why so few people are interested in it. I mean, we think non-duality is, it's a big thing. It's kind of, in a way, it's taken over from the spiritual. There used to be a thing, I can remember it many years ago, called conferences called Science and Spirituality. And then at a certain point, that got recast as Science and Non-Duality. So it's been a pretty big takeover in there in the spiritual world. Nonetheless, if you look at the population in general, non-duality does not attract a lot of interest in the population in general, and particularly if we're thinking, and this is an unwise phrase for me to use, particularly if we're thinking of pure non-duality, in other words, non-duality without the whistles and bells that are added to it, gets very, very little interest, really. I'm not surprised. It's not a very interesting story.
But I think it's slowly starting to change.
Maybe, we'll see. Maybe, yeah, maybe. But going back to what you said back there, yeah, it's in its kind of pure form, which is not a good word for me to use, it is utterly minimalist. You know. I mean, maybe I suddenly started thinking of something like a Samuel Beckett play or something, but it's just occurred to me, you know, the purest form of a non-duality talk. Well, first of all, I want to say it's a speaker sitting in a chair but not saying anything. But of course that's wrong, you know, pursuing it a bit further, it would just be an empty chair. People would pay their £15 to come into a room and sit there, and there'd just be an empty chair at the front of the room. That would be the purest form of non-duality communication.